Mark Goodwin had always cherished his uncle's legacy, a house perched on the edge of a once peaceful suburban neighborhood. The house was unlike any other in the area, an architectural masterpiece designed by his late uncle, a visionary artist and eccentric architect who believed in pushing the boundaries of conventional design. Built with sharp angles, vast glass walls, and surrounded by a sparse, desert-inspired garden, the house stood as a testament to individualism amidst a sea of cookie-cutter homes. Mark, a collector of rare books and historical artifacts, had recently moved in after inheriting the property. For him, this home wasn't just a place to live, it was a sanctuary where he could work, dream, and preserve the priceless pieces of history he had dedicated his life to collecting. Mark wasn't particularly close to his neighbors. He had never seen much value in the gossip and polite smiles that seemed to dominate the community. His days were spent immersed in research, cataloging his growing collection, and working on a book that chronicled the lives of revolutionary leaders. The house was a perfect escape, its high walls and remote location shielding him from the noise and prying eyes of the world. The neighborhood association, which had a reputation for strict rules and invasive oversight, was something he had consciously avoided. His uncle, with his defiant spirit, had ensured that the property was legally exempt from the association's jurisdiction when it was built decades ago. Mark had always considered this exemption a small but significant victory for personal freedom. One evening, after returning from a dinner with a fellow historian, Mark immediately sensed that something was wrong. The driveway, usually neat and clean, was littered with debris, shards of glass, a broken piece of what looked like a wooden frame, and crushed bits of ceramic. The gate, which was always locked, hung slightly ajar. Mark's pulse quickened as he parked his car and stepped out, the cool night air suddenly feeling suffocating. He pushed the gate open and walked toward the house, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The front door, a custom piece of heavy oak and frosted glass, was wide open. He froze for a moment, staring into the dark void of the entrance, the warm glow of his home replaced by cold shadows. Inside, chaos reigned. The carefully curated order that defined Mark's life had been obliterated. Furniture was overturned, shelves were emptied, and the rare books that had once lined the walls of his study were strewn across the floor, many of them ripped apart or water-damaged. Shattered glass from display cases crunched under his shoes as he moved deeper into the house, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In the living room, one of the most valuable items in his collection, a first edition of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, was missing, its empty display case lying cracked on the floor. A trail of muddy boot prints led from the front door to his private study, where the destruction was even worse. His custom-built humidity-controlled storage system, designed to protect fragile documents and artifacts, had been smashed, its contents dumped haphazardly onto the floor. Mark's heart sank further as he moved toward the basement. The door had been forced open, and the light flickered ominously as he descended the stairs. Here, his most precious artifacts were stored items that couldn't be displayed openly due to their rarity and value. He prayed that this part of the house had been spared, but his hope was short-lived. The glass display case housing a centuries-old navigation compass, believed to have been used during the American Revolution, was shattered. The compass itself was gone. Nearby, an 18th-century handwritten letter signed by George Washington was torn in two, one half missing entirely. Mark clenched his fists, feeling a mix of fury and helplessness. Whoever had done this hadn't just stolen from him, they had desecrated history. Amidst the wreckage, something caught his eye, a document, carelessly tossed onto the remains of his desk. It was a formal notice printed on thick, cream-colored paper with an embossed letterhead he didn't recognize. The words "Mandatory Inspection Notice" stood out in bold at the top of the page, followed by a list of supposed violations: improper exterior design, non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards, and unauthorized structural modifications. The notice concluded with a chilling warning: failure to rectify these issues will result in additional fines and enforcement actions. Mark scanned the paper for more details, searching for a signature or contact information, but there was nothing. No name, no phone number, just an official-sounding title: enforcement officer. His grip tightened around the paper, crumpling it in his hand as he struggled to contain his anger. It didn't make sense. Mark's property was exempt from the neighborhood association's control. It had been that way since the house was built. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, searching for anything he might have missed, a warning, a notification, anything. But there was nothing. His inbox was filled with the usual messages, offers from auction houses, updates from historians, and automated bills. No alerts, no prior communication about any inspection. It was as if this enforcement action had appeared out of nowhere. Mark spent the next hour combing through the house, documenting the damage with his phone's camera. Every shattered artifact, every torn book, every overturned piece of furniture was photographed in painstaking detail. He called the local police, but their response was disheartening. The officer on the line told him it sounded like a civil matter and advised him to contact the neighborhood association directly. Mark tried to explain that he wasn't a member of the association, that his property was legally separate, but the officer's tone remained dismissive. "File a report if you want," the officer said, "but this isn't something we'd typically get involved in." By the time Mark finished his call, the reality of the situation was sinking in. Someone had violated the sanctity of his home, destroyed his possessions, and left behind a document that raised more questions than answers. The house, once his sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. As he stood in the wreckage of his study, surrounded by the ruins of his life's work, Mark made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go unanswered. Whoever was behind this, they had made a grave mistake. Mark spent the following morning in a daze, pacing through his ruined home as the previous night's events replayed over and over in his mind. His initial anger had given way to a simmering unease. Something about the situation felt deliberately targeted. It wasn't just the destruction of his possessions. As devastating as that was, it was the systematic nature of it. The notice left behind, with its vague violations and lack of clear origin, gnawed at him like a splinter lodged deep beneath his skin. He needed answers, and he needed them now. After securing the house as best as he could, Mark called the number for the neighborhood's governing body. It was a group he had avoided interacting with since moving in, but now it seemed unavoidable. The phone rang several times before an automated voice greeted him. It instructed him to leave a message or consult their website for general inquiries. Frustrated, Mark hung up and decided to visit their office in person. If they had sent the so-called enforcement officers, they would have to explain themselves. The office was located in a small strip mall on the other side of town, tucked between a bank and a nail salon. The sterile, corporate appearance of the place clashed with the casual suburban atmosphere of the neighborhood. Mark walked in and was greeted by a receptionist who barely looked up from her computer screen. "How can I help you?" she asked in a monotone voice, as though she had asked this question 1,000 times before. Mark took a deep breath, trying to suppress the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I need to speak with someone about this." He pulled the crumpled notice from his pocket and smoothed it out on the counter. The receptionist glanced at it briefly before tapping on her keyboard. "Do you have a property ID number?" she asked, her tone devoid of urgency. "I don't even know what that is," Mark replied, his patience wearing thin. "My house was broken into last night. They wrecked everything, and they left this behind. I'm not even part of your group, so I want to know what the hell is going on." The receptionist finally looked up, her expression a mixture of boredom and mild annoyance. "If you're not part of the community association, then this notice probably doesn't apply to you," she said with a shrug. "But if enforcement officers were at your property, there must have been a reason." Mark leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "There was no reason. My property is legally exempt from your association. It always has been. So explain to me how people representing your organization had the authority to enter my home, destroy my belongings, and leave this notice." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. One moment she muttered before disappearing into a back room. Mark crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the door she had vanished through. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, a tall man in a tailored suit emerged. He had a polished, professional demeanor and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Goodwin?" I presume the man said, extending a hand. I'm Robert Langley, Head of Compliance for the Community Association. I understand there's been some confusion. Mark ignored the handshake. Confusion, he echoed. My home was ransacked last night by people claiming to represent your organization. I want answers. Langley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning in full force. I assure you, our enforcement team operates strictly within the bounds of the law. If they visited your property, it's because there was a legitimate concern. There's nothing legitimate about what happened, Mark shot back. Your people forced their way in, destroyed private property, and left a bogus notice full of vague violations. My house isn't even under your jurisdiction. Langley raised an eyebrow. That may have been true in the past, but recent amendments to our governing charter have expanded our oversight. Properties previously excluded from the association are now subject to compliance standards if they fall within certain designated zones. Mark stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. You're telling me you just decided, out of nowhere, that my property belongs to you now, without notifying me, without giving me a chance to respond? Langley's tone remained infuriatingly calm. The amendments were publicly announced, and all affected property owners were sent written notifications. If you didn't receive one, I'd recommend checking with your postal service. Mark clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. I didn't receive anything because this entire thing is a sham. You had no right to step onto my property, let alone destroy it. Langley spread his hands in a gesture of mock sympathy. I understand your frustration, Mr. Goodwin, but our primary concern is the well-being of the community. If your property was found to be in violation, it's our responsibility to address those issues. Mark felt his composure slipping. Violations? Of what? My house is structurally sound, my land is maintained, and I haven't bothered a single person since I moved in. What possible violation could justify what you've done? Langley's smile faded entirely, replaced by a steely expression. If you have further concerns, I suggest you consult legal counsel. As far as the association is concerned, we acted within our rights. Mark's jaw tightened as Langley turned and walked away, leaving him standing there seething. The receptionist avoided his gaze as he stormed out of the office, his mind racing. This wasn't just bureaucracy gone mad, this was a calculated power play, and he was the target. Back at home, Mark's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line caught his attention: urgent information about your property. The message was brief and cryptic. They're lying. Your property is worth more than you think. Meet me at 7 p.m. at the coffee shop on Main Street if you want the truth. There was no signature, no further explanation. Mark hesitated. He didn't like the idea of walking into a potentially dangerous situation, but his options were limited. The police had been no help, and the association clearly had no intention of backing down. If this anonymous sender had answers, he couldn't afford to ignore them. As the clock neared 7, Mark made his way to the coffee shop, a nondescript place tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, scanning the room for anyone who might be looking for him. Minutes passed, and no one approached. Just as he began to wonder if the email had been a hoax, a woman slid into the chair across from him. She was in her late 40s, dressed in plain but professional attire, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Mr. Goodwin, she said, her voice low. I don't have much time, so listen carefully. Your property is sitting on a piece of land that certain people want very badly. They'll do whatever it takes to get it, including rewriting jurisdictional boundaries and fabricating violations. Mark leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Who are you? How do you know this? The woman glanced around the room before answering. Let's just say I've seen this happen before. The association isn't acting alone. They're working with developers who've been quietly buying up properties in this area. Your house is the last holdout. If you lose it, they get everything they need. Mark's mind raced as her words sank in. This wasn't just about compliance or community standards, it was a land grab, plain and simple. Why are you telling me this, he asked. Because they don't just take your property, she said, her expression darkening. They ruin you in the process. And if you're not careful, they'll make sure you don't have the resources to fight back. Before Mark could ask another question, the woman stood and walked out, leaving him alone with more questions than answers. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than he had imagined and far more dangerous. Mark didn't sleep that night. The cryptic warnings from the woman at the coffee shop swirled in his mind, feeding a growing sense of dread. If what she said was true, he wasn't just facing an overzealous governing group, he was up against a coordinated effort to strip him of his property. His house, his collection, his sanctuary, all of it was a target in a high-stakes game he hadn't even known he was playing. But now that he did, he wasn't about to roll over and let them take everything without a fight. By dawn, Mark was already on the phone with his lawyer, Emma Carver. She was sharp, direct, and known for her ability to navigate the murky waters of property law. Mark explained everything: the break-in, the damage, the fabricated violations, and the unsettling conversation with the woman at the coffee shop. He left nothing out, not even his growing suspicion that this was all part of a land grab orchestrated by developers. Emma listened without interrupting, her pen scratching furiously on a notepad. When he finished, she let out a low whistle. "This is more than just a jurisdictional dispute," she said. "If they're fabricating violations and colluding with developers, that's a serious breach of the law. But proving it won't be easy. These groups are experts at covering their tracks." "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "First, we need to establish the boundaries of your property and the legal exemptions your uncle secured when the house was built. If those exemptions still hold, we can challenge their jurisdiction outright. I'll also file a temporary injunction to stop them from taking further action while we investigate. But Mark, I need you to be prepared for pushback. These people don't play fair." Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see him through the phone. "Do whatever it takes. I'm not letting them win." Within hours, Emma had drafted and filed the injunction, which effectively froze any enforcement actions against Mark's property. It was a small victory, but a necessary first step. Meanwhile, Mark began combing through his late uncle's files, searching for any documentation that could support their case. The house had been built decades ago, and his uncle had been meticulous about keeping records. Somewhere in those dusty folders, Mark hoped to find the original agreements that excluded the property from the association's control. As he sifted through the papers in his study, Mark's phone buzzed with a new email. It was from an address he didn't recognize, but the subject line sent a chill down his spine: "Your injunction won't save you." He opened the message with trepidation. The body of the email was brief, and to the point: "You think you can fight this? You have no idea what you're up against. Back down now or things will get worse." There was no signature, no way to trace the sender. Mark stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to break him. That evening, as Mark stepped outside to clear his head, he noticed something strange. His mailbox, which had been intact that morning, was now hanging off its post, its door twisted and dented. He knelt to inspect it and found a small, folded piece of paper stuffed inside. Unfolding it, he saw a crude drawing of his house with a large red X scrawled over it. Beneath the drawing were 3 words: "You've been warned." Mark felt his stomach churn. This was no longer just a legal battle, it was personal. Whoever was targeting him wanted him to feel unsafe in his own home, to second-guess every move he made. But instead of fear, Mark felt a surge of defiance. If they thought they could scare him into submission, they had underestimated him. The next day, Emma called with an update. "I've reviewed the original agreements your uncle signed, and it's clear that your property was legally exempt from the governing group's oversight. But here's the problem: their recent charter amendments include a clause that essentially overrides those exemptions. It's a legal gray area. But they might argue that their authority now extends to your property." "So what does that mean for us?" Mark asked. "It means we need to find out why they're so desperate to include your property in their jurisdiction," Emma replied. "There's more to this than compliance violations. We need evidence of their true motives, something that links them to the developers or shows malicious intent." Mark sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "And how do we get that evidence?" Emma hesitated. "That's the tricky part. These groups are good at keeping things off the record. But if there's a paper trail, we'll find it." Later that afternoon, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed a high-resolution security system around his property, complete with motion-activated cameras and floodlights. If anyone tried to trespass again, he would have video proof. He also began reaching out to his neighbors, hoping to find someone who had faced similar issues. Most were reluctant to talk, offering vague excuses about being too busy or not wanting to get involved. But one neighbor, an elderly man named Gerald, agreed to meet with Mark privately. Over cups of coffee in Gerald's modest kitchen, the older man revealed a troubling pattern. "You're not the first, you know," Gerald said, his voice low. "They've been doing this for years, pushing people out, claiming it's about compliance or safety. But it's all a front. Once someone leaves, their property gets sold off to developers for next to nothing." "Why hasn't anyone fought back?" Mark asked. "Some tried," Gerald replied, his gaze distant. "But it's not easy. They use every trick in the book: fines, lawsuits, even false accusations. And when that doesn't work, they find other ways to make your life miserable. Most people don't have the resources to keep fighting." Mark felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" Gerald sighed. "Because I've seen what happens when you stand alone. If you're going to take them on, you need to be smart about it. Don't let them see you coming." As Mark walked back home, Gerald's words echoed in his mind. He knew the older man was right. This wasn't a fight he could win with brute force or stubbornness. He needed strategy, allies, and above all, evidence. That night, as Mark reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Two men in dark clothing were prowling near the edge of his property, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them appeared to be carrying a tool bag, while the other held a clipboard. They moved with purpose, scanning the area as if looking for something. Mark watched as they approached the boundary line, hesitated for a moment, and then retreated into the shadows. He rewound the footage and watched it again, his mind racing. Whoever these men were, they weren't casual trespassers. They were scouting his property, likely planning their next move. Mark saved the footage and sent it to Emma with a message: "We have visitors. Let's use this." As the hours dragged on, Mark felt a growing sense of determination. The people targeting him had made one critical mistake: they had underestimated his resolve. They might have power, resources, and influence, but Mark had something they didn't: the will to fight for what was his. And he was just getting started. The following morning, Mark sat in his study, staring at the footage of the two men prowling near the edge of his property. Their deliberate movements and the fact that they had carried tools and a clipboard suggested that this wasn't a random act of trespassing. Whoever they were, they had a purpose, and Mark suspected it wasn't anything good. The footage only deepened his resolve to figure out who was behind all of this and why his property had become such a focal point for their schemes. Emma called mid-morning with an update. "Mark, I've started digging into the charter amendments they referenced. From what I've seen so far, these changes weren't just about increasing oversight, they were strategic. They specifically target properties on the outskirts of the community. Like yours. It's no coincidence that your house is now under their jurisdiction. This was planned." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I mean, someone went to a lot of trouble to ensure properties like yours could be roped into their control. These amendments were pushed through quietly, buried in dense legalese. And I'd bet good money that most residents didn't even realize what they were signing off on. The language is vague enough to pass as routine governance, but in reality, it's designed to benefit someone, and it's not the homeowners." Mark exhaled slowly, trying to process what she was saying. "So what's the next step?" "We need to figure out who's really behind this. I'm reaching out to some contacts in real estate law to see if there's a connection to developers or investors. In the meantime, I want you to stay vigilant. If those men come back, we need more than just footage. We need something that ties them directly to the group or their associates." As soon as the call ended, Mark set to work. He reviewed the footage again, this time looking for any identifying details he might have missed. One of the men had a patch on his jacket, nothing official, but it looked like the logo of a local construction company. Mark made a note to research the company later. For now, he needed to focus on securing his property. He reinforced the locks on his doors and windows and added motion-activated lights to the blind spots on the perimeter. If they came back, they wouldn't go unnoticed. Later that day, Mark decided to visit Gerald again. The elderly neighbor had been surprisingly forthcoming during their first meeting, and Mark hoped he might know more about the history of the group and their tactics. Gerald welcomed him into his modest home, gesturing for him to sit at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mark began, "about how they've done this before. Do you know if anyone ever fought back successfully?" Gerald rubbed his chin thoughtfully. There was one family, the Harpers. They lived on the far side of the neighborhood, near the old railway tracks. The group tried to pull the same stunt on them, claimed their house was unsafe, slapped them with fines, and threatened foreclosure. But the Harpers didn't go quietly. They brought in lawyers, filed complaints with the state, the whole 9 yards. "What happened?" Mark asked, leaning forward. "They won the first round," Gerald said with a faint smile, "got the fines overturned, and the group backed off for a while. But then he trailed off, his expression darkening. But then what?" Mark pressed. Gerald hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window. Their house caught fire, middle of the night. The official report said it was an electrical fault, but a lot of people thought otherwise. The Harpers left town not long after that. A chill ran down Mark's spine. "Are you saying they burned the house down?" "I'm saying it's a strange coincidence," Gerald replied. "And in this neighborhood, coincidences tend to benefit the same people." Mark left Gerald's house with a heavy heart. The story about the Harpers was both a cautionary tale and a grim reminder of what he was up against. If these people were willing to go that far, he needed to be ready for anything. He resolved to dig deeper into the Harpers case, hoping it might provide clues about the group's methods. That evening, Emma called again. Her voice was tense, almost urgent. "Mark, I found something. One of my contacts in real estate sent me a list of recent transactions in your area. There's a pattern: multiple properties on the outskirts of the community were sold to the same LLC over the past year. And guess who's listed as the managing partner of that LLC?" "Who?" Mark asked. Though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "Robert Langley," Emma said. "The head of compliance for the group." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "So he's not just enforcing these fake violations, he's profiting from them." "Exactly. And it gets worse. The LLC is tied to a major development company that's been buying up land for a planned luxury shopping center and high-rise apartments. Your property is one of the last pieces they need to complete the puzzle." Mark's mind raced as he pieced it together. The fabricated violations, the break-ins, the intimidation, it was all part of a larger scheme to force him out so they could cash in on the land. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We need hard evidence," Emma replied. "Something that links Langley and the group directly to the development company. Without that, it's just circumstantial." Mark spent the next several days gathering as much information as he could. He scoured public records, combed through local news archives, and even reached out to the woman who had warned him at the coffee shop. She was hesitant to speak further, but she did confirm that Langley had a reputation for making problems disappear. One night, as Mark was reviewing his security footage, the motion sensors on his cameras activated. His heart pounded as he pulled up the live feed. 2 figures were back, this time near the back of his property. They were carrying what looked like surveying equipment and marking the ground with spray paint. Mark grabbed his phone and called Emma. "They're here again," he whispered. "They're marking something on my property." "Stay inside," Emma instructed. "Don't confront them. Just get as much footage as you can." Mark followed her advice, filming the men from a safe distance until they finally disappeared into the night. The next morning, he inspected the area where they had been working. Faint spray-painted lines crisscrossed the ground, forming what looked like boundary markers. Nearby, he found a small flag with the logo of a construction company, the same one he had seen on the man's jacket in the earlier footage. Armed with this new evidence, Emma began building their case. She filed a formal complaint with the state's attorney general, citing illegal land grabs and potential corruption within the group. But even as they made progress, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were about to get even higher. That night, as he locked up the house, he noticed a car parked across the street. It was unmarked, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't see who was inside. The car didn't move, and whoever was inside made no attempt to approach. Mark closed the blinds and double-checked his security system. The message was clear: they were watching. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his laptop, a mix of fear and determination coursing through him. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. But as he prepared for the next round, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The question was no longer if they would strike again, it was when. Mark woke up to the shrill sound of his phone vibrating against his nightstand. It was Emma, and her voice sounded unusually tense. "Mark, we have a problem," she began without preamble. "The temporary injunction I filed has been challenged. They're claiming that your refusal to comply with the violations constitutes an immediate threat to public safety. They've requested an expedited hearing, and it's set for next week." Mark sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. Public safety? That's ridiculous. How could my house pose a threat to anyone? Emma's voice was sharp. "It's not about the truth, Mark. It's about creating enough pressure to make you fold. They want to paint you as a rogue homeowner who refuses to follow community standards. The judge they've assigned is known for favoring governing bodies in disputes like this. If we don't have something solid by the hearing, there's a real chance they'll move to enforce penalties or even declare your property unsafe." Mark clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. What do we need to fight this? Evidence that ties their actions to the developers and proves this is all a scheme to force you out. Right now, everything we have is circumstantial. We need something concrete: documents, insider testimony, anything that directly links them to illegal activity. As the call ended, Mark felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had already fortified his property and gathered what evidence he could, but it wasn't enough. If they were escalating, so would he. Determined to find answers, he decided to take a more proactive approach. That evening, Mark revisited the footage of the men marking his property with spray paint. He zoomed in on the construction company logo on the flag they had left behind and began searching for information online. It didn't take long to uncover that the company, Silver Ridge Developments, had ties to several controversial projects in the state. Multiple reports accused them of using aggressive tactics to acquire land, often through third-party shell companies. One of those companies matched the LLC Emma had linked to Robert Langley. It was a start, but it wasn't enough to blow the case open. Mark needed more, and he knew the only way to get it was to dig deeper. He decided to return to Gerald, the only neighbor who had been willing to speak openly about the group's activities. Maybe Gerald had more information he hadn't shared yet. When Mark arrived at Gerald's house the next morning, something felt off. The curtains were drawn, and the usually well-kept front yard was in disarray. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just as he was about to leave, the door creaked open slightly, and Gerald peered out, his face pale and drawn. "Mark," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here." "What's going on?" Mark asked, lowering his voice. "Are you all right?" Gerald hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the door. "They came by last night," he said finally. "Two men. Said they were doing a routine survey. But it wasn't routine. They asked about you. Wanted to know if you'd been causing trouble, if you'd spoken to anyone about the group. I didn't tell them anything, but, Mark, they're watching me now. There was a car parked outside all night." Mark felt a surge of guilt. By involving Gerald, he had inadvertently put the older man in danger. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." "It's not your fault," Gerald replied, his voice trembling. "But you need to be careful. These people don't play fair. They'll do whatever it takes to win." As Mark walked back to his car, he noticed a black SUV idling at the end of the street. Its windows were tinted, and its engine hummed softly. He kept his head down and his pace steady, but his heart was racing. Gerald was right, they were watching, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Later that day, Mark received an unexpected email from the woman who had warned him at the coffee shop. The message contained a single line of text: "If you want the truth, meet me tonight at 10 p.m. by the old water tower." Attached to the email was a map with the location marked. Mark hesitated. He knew it could be a trap, but he also knew he couldn't afford to ignore it. If this woman had information that could expose the group's true motives, it might be his only chance. At 10 p.m. sharp, Mark arrived at the desolate water tower on the outskirts of town. The area was eerily quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. He parked his car and stepped out, scanning the shadows for any sign of the woman. After a few tense minutes, she emerged from the darkness, her face partially obscured by a scarf. "You came," she said, her voice low. "Why am I here?" Mark asked, keeping his distance. "What do you have for me?" She held up a flash drive. "This has everything you need: emails, financial records, even internal memos. It proves that the group and Silver Ridge Developments are working together to force out homeowners like you. But you need to be careful. If they find out you have this, they won't stop at intimidation." Mark reached for the flash drive, but she pulled it back. "One condition," she said. "You never saw me. If anyone asks, you found this on your own." "Agreed," Mark said, taking the drive. "Why are you helping me?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the shadows. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when people don't fight back." "Good luck, Mark, with that." She disappeared into the night, leaving him alone with the key to unraveling the entire scheme. Back at home, Mark plugged the flash drive into his computer and opened the files. What he found was staggering: a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. There were contracts linking the group to Silver Ridge Developments, emails discussing strategies to pressure homeowners into selling, and even a list of targeted properties. His house was at the top of the list. One email from Langley to a Silver Ridge executive stood out: "Goodwin is being stubborn. Increase the pressure. We need that property before the end of the quarter." Mark sent the files to Emma immediately. "This is it," she said when he called her. "This is what we needed. I'll start drafting a formal complaint and submit it to the Attorney General. This could blow the whole thing wide open." But even as they made progress, Mark knew the fight was far from over. The group wouldn't go down without a fight, and he had a sinking feeling they were about to escalate their tactics. He was right. The next morning, Mark woke to the sound of his security alarm blaring. He rushed outside to find his car windows smashed and his mailbox engulfed in flames. Spray painted across his garage door were the words, "This is your last warning." Mark's hands clenched into fists. They were trying to scare him into submission, but it wasn't going to work. With the evidence now in Emma's hands, he had the upper hand, and he wasn't about to back down. As he stared at the smoldering remains of his mailbox, Mark made a promise to himself: no matter what they threw at him next, he would see this through to the end. The days leading up to the expedited hearing were a whirlwind of tension and preparation. Emma worked tirelessly to organize the evidence Mark had obtained, building a case that not only challenged the fabricated violations, but also exposed the orchestrated scheme behind them. The files from the flash drive were damning, filled with incriminating details that linked Robert Langley and the development company to illegal land grabs and harassment tactics. Mark knew this was their best shot to dismantle the group's plans, but the growing threats weighed heavily on him. The burned mailbox and smashed car windows had been bold acts of intimidation, and he had no doubt the group would escalate further if pushed. The morning of the hearing arrived with a grim, overcast sky. Mark sat in the courthouse waiting area, his nerves frayed as he reviewed the notes Emma had given him. She had warned him to remain composed, no matter how aggressively the group's lawyers tried to paint him as a troublemaker. It was a tactic they often used, turning the victim into the antagonist. Mark felt the weight of her words as the courtroom doors opened and the bailiff called their case. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The group's legal team, a cadre of sharp-suited attorneys, took their seats with an air of smug confidence. Robert Langley sat among them, his expression calm but his eyes betraying a hint of unease. Emma leaned over to Mark and whispered, "Remember, they're expecting you to lose your temper. Don't give them the satisfaction." The proceedings began with the group's lead attorney presenting their argument. She spoke with polished authority, claiming that Mark's property posed a danger to the community due to its non-compliance with aesthetic and safety standards. She cited the spray-painted lines found on Mark's property as evidence that the house was in violation of newly amended zoning requirements. The association's enforcement team acted within their rights, she concluded, her tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Goodwin's refusal to comply has left us no choice but to seek judicial intervention." When Emma rose to speak, her calm, methodical demeanor was a stark contrast. She began by dismantling the group's claims one by one, presenting evidence that Mark's property had been legally exempt from their jurisdiction for decades. She pointed out the irregularities in the amended charter, highlighting how it had been crafted specifically to target certain properties. Then, with the courtroom's attention firmly on her, Emma unveiled the files from the flash drive. These documents, she said, holding up a thick binder, reveal a coordinated effort by the group's leadership to pressure homeowners into selling their properties under false pretenses. My client's home is one of several targeted for acquisition by a development company, Silver Ridge Developments, which is directly tied to Robert Langley. She stepped toward the judge, placing the binder on his bench. Your Honor, these emails and financial records show not only a conflict of interest but also potential fraud and harassment. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge flipped through the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. The group's attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence visibly waning. Langley's composure cracked as Emma continued to lay out her case, presenting testimony from neighbors who had faced similar harassment and pointing to the spray-painted boundary markers as evidence of the group's underhanded tactics. Just as it seemed the tide was turning, the group's lead attorney stood and requested a recess. Her tone was sharp, her confidence replaced by a defensive edge. The judge granted the request, giving both sides an hour to regroup. During the recess, Emma pulled Mark aside. They're scrambling, she said, her eyes alight with determination. But don't let your guard down. They're going to come back swinging. Mark nodded, though his thoughts were racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Langley had something up his sleeve. As the hour ticked by, he braced himself for what was to come. When the hearing resumed, the group's attorney launched a counterattack, accusing Mark of fabricating evidence and claiming that the files from the flash drive were obtained illegally. This so-called evidence cannot be trusted, she argued. It's nothing more than a desperate attempt to discredit a legitimate organization. Emma shot to her feet, her voice firm. Your Honor, the files were provided by a whistleblower within the organization, a person who saw firsthand the unethical practices being carried out. If the defense wants to challenge the authenticity of the evidence, we're prepared to request a forensic analysis. The judge raised a hand, silencing the back and forth. Enough, he said, his tone stern. He turned to the group's attorney. Do you have any evidence to refute these claims? The attorney hesitated, glancing at Langley, whose face had turned pale. We would request more time to review the documents, she said finally. The judge's gaze hardened. You've had ample opportunity to prepare for this hearing. I'm not inclined to grant further delays. In the tense silence that followed, Emma made her final statement. She urged the court to see the group's actions for what they were, an abuse of power driven by greed. She emphasized the broader implications of the case, warning that allowing such behavior to go unchecked would set a dangerous precedent. The judge adjourned the hearing, promising a ruling by the following week. As Mark and Emma left the courthouse, they were met with a throng of reporters. Word of the case had spread, and the media was hungry for details. Emma shielded Mark from the cameras, guiding him to a waiting car. Let's focus on the next steps, she said, her tone measured. This isn't over yet. Back at home, Mark felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The hearing had gone better than he'd expected, but the group's response during the recess had unnerved him. He knew they wouldn't go down without a fight, and he suspected their next move would be more desperate and more dangerous. That night, as he reviewed the day's events, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Nice performance today. Don't get too comfortable. Mark stared at the message, his jaw tightening. The battle was far from over, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The ruling came a week later, delivered in the quiet hum of a courtroom packed with tension. Mark sat beside Emma, his hands tightly clasped together as the judge read his decision. The group's actions, the judge declared, were a clear overreach of authority and a violation of multiple statutes, including harassment and fraudulent conduct. The court ordered an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against Mark's property, nullified the fabricated violations, and imposed significant fines on the group for their misconduct. More importantly, the evidence Emma had presented would be forwarded to the state's attorney general for further investigation into potential criminal charges against Robert Langley and his associates. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him as the gavel struck. The fight had been brutal, but he had won a decisive victory. Emma leaned over, a triumphant smile on her face. "You did it, Mark. They can't touch you anymore." But even as they left the courthouse, Mark knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The damage done to his property, his collection, and his sense of security couldn't be undone with a court ruling. His house, once a sanctuary, still bore the scars of the group's campaign against him: shattered windows, spray-painted walls, and the loss of irreplaceable artifacts. As he drove home, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever feel truly safe there again. The following weeks were a flurry of activity. The state launched an official investigation into the group, uncovering a sprawling web of corruption and collusion with Silver Ridge developments. Langley and several other high-ranking officials were arrested, and the organization was forced to disband. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to rebuild itself free from their oppressive control. Mark, however, was left with difficult decisions. The damage to his property was extensive, and the cost of repairs far exceeded the fines imposed on the group. Insurance would cover some of it, but not enough to restore his home to its former glory. And then there was the emotional toll, the constant sense of unease, the knowledge that his privacy had been violated, and the lingering threat of retaliation from those who had lost so much at his hands. One afternoon, as Mark stood in the middle of his study surveying the wreckage, Emma stopped by with a folder in hand. "I've been thinking," she said, setting it on the table. "You've got the perfect platform to turn this into something meaningful. What if we use the publicity from the case to create a coalition for homeowners dealing with similar issues? You could share your story, help others fight back." Mark looked at her, surprised. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I barely made it through this myself." "Exactly," Emma said. "That's why people will listen. You didn't just win a case, you exposed an entire system. People need to know they're not alone." Mark mulled it over for days, unsure if he wanted to take on such a public role. But as the news coverage of the case grew, so did the number of letters and emails he received from others who had faced similar battles. Their stories echoed his own tales of harassment, intimidation, and legal battles against faceless organizations that seemed untouchable. Slowly, a sense of purpose began to replace his exhaustion. If his ordeal could make a difference for someone else, perhaps it had all been worth it. In the months that followed, Mark transformed his home into more than just a residence. He rebuilt it as a symbol of resilience, turning part of the property into a space for community gatherings and educational workshops on homeowner rights. His collection, though diminished, became the centerpiece of a small public library where locals could learn about history, law, and the power of standing up against corruption. Though the scars of the fight remained, Mark found solace in the connections he built and the knowledge that his story had inspired others. His house, once a battleground, became a place of healing not just for him, but for the community that had rallied around him. And as he stood on the front porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight had been worth it, not just for his home, but for the legacy he had created in its wake.